In the stillness of a forgotten village, long before the world moved at the pace of machines and screens, there whispered a tale no one dared to write down. It was a story that crept through the walls of old homes, hidden in the murmurs of grandmothers who refused to say too much, and in the way men averted their eyes when the name of one particular family was spoken. A tale so unsettling, so disturbing, that even the passing of centuries could not wash away its stain. Tonight, you've stumbled into that story, the one no history book was willing to keep alive. Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before this story pulls you in too deep. Because what you're about to hear may feel like myth, but every whisper carries the shadow of something true. The family lived at the edge of a barren road, their house little more than a skeleton of stone and wood. But what happened inside those walls was not poverty alone. It was hunger, and hunger can twist the human soul into shapes unrecognizable. They had a daughter, the youngest of them, who was said to carry beauty and strangeness in equal measure. Her eyes were too wide, her smile almost knowing, as though she held secrets from a place no one else could see. Villagers whispered that she was both a blessing and a curse. When the winters came, harsh and merciless, with no crops to be harvested and no animals left to slaughter, the family's hunger reached a place beyond desperation. There are rumors, dark and unrelenting, that the girl had grown ill. Too weak to leave her bed, her breath shallow, her skin pale as the snow that covered the earth. And that is when the whispers turn into something much harder to ignore. Some say she passed quietly, her body cold before the morning sun had risen. But others insist she was not entirely gone, that her eyes still flickered faintly when the family made their choice. A choice not of survival alone, but of something older, darker, bound to rituals no villager would ever dare perform. They ate from her flesh, not all at once, but slowly, carefully, like a secret meant to be savored rather than revealed. And in doing so, they bound themselves to something far more horrifying than starvation. This was no accident of desperation. This was communion, and it would stain the family's bloodline forever. The villagers noticed changes, though none dared speak of them openly. The family, who once appeared gaunt and starving, now moved with an eerie vitality. Their cheeks regained color too quickly for a season still buried in frost, and their eyes, once dull with despair, seemed sharpened, glistening with a strange satisfaction. Children were warned not to look too long, for the gaze of that household carried something that felt less than human. It was said that when the snow melted and spring tried to return, the family refused to plant. Their hands no longer dug the earth, no longer sowed seeds. Why would they, if their hunger had found another source? Some whispered they carried jars hidden in their cellar, sealed in ways that suggested preservation, not of fruits or meats, but of something far more grotesque. The thought itself sent shivers through the community, yet no one confronted them. Fear was a prison stronger than hunger. The daughter's absence was explained away with murmured excuses. She was visiting relatives in another town. She had been taken ill and moved to recover elsewhere. But the villagers noticed how no letters ever came. No visitors ever arrived, and the family grew restless whenever her name slipped into conversation. At night, neighbors swore they heard strange chanting carried by the wind, like low voices in unison, calling for something they could not name. An old diary, discovered decades later beneath the floorboards of a neighbor's house, contained a chilling entry. It spoke of the night when smoke rose from the chimney and an unholy scent drifted across the fields. Not the scent of bread, nor the fat of slaughtered animals, but something sickly sweet, thick enough to cling to the skin. The writer admitted they dared not investigate, for the sound of laughter, high, sharp, and terribly wrong, echoed long into the darkness. Some historians dismiss this account as folklore, a fabrication born of suspicion and isolation. But others argue that dismissing it too quickly is itself a sign of fear. Because what if it was true? What if a family could feed not just on flesh, but on the silence of those around them, consuming body and memory alike, until the truth itself rotted away? Time has a way of burying horrors, yet some truths refuse to stay silent. The family's story might have vanished entirely, had it not been for a strange discovery made many years later. When the old house finally collapsed, swallowed by ivy and rain, villagers gathered to sift through its remains. Beneath the splintered beams and stones, they found bones. Not just animal bones, as one might expect in a rural homestead, but small fragments, unmistakably human. Some were charred, others bore the marks of knives, and a few seemed deliberately polished, as though handled and touched far too often. The villagers recoiled, yet none claimed surprise. Their silence was an admission. They had always known something was wrong. What truly disturbed them, however, was that among the remains lay not one skeleton, but several. The daughter's was only the first. How many had followed? Travelers had often vanished on the long road that wound past their house. Vagabonds, beggars, men seeking shelter for a night. At the time, it was blamed on bandits or the wilderness itself. But what if the truth was more intimate, more horrifying? What if those unlucky wanderers had not been lost to the forest, but had found themselves welcomed into that crooked house, only to never leave again? Local priests tried to intervene after the discovery, calling it sacrilege, and demanded the ruins be blessed, the bones buried in consecrated ground. Yet witnesses wrote that the soil itself seemed to reject the bones. Shovels broke, the earth turned hard, and storms rose as if nature itself resisted. It was finally decided the bones would be scattered quietly into the river, carried far away from the town. A decision made in haste, but one that only deepened the mystery, because not long after, strange sightings were reported along the riverbanks, pale figures drifting in the fog, a woman with hollow eye, as walking barefoot through the reeds. A family of shadows, lingering by the water's edge, always together, always silent. The villagers swore it was them, the family who had consumed their own daughter's flesh, cursed now to wander forever, unable to cross into rest. These sightings were never written in official records. They lived only in whispers, traded from grandmother to child, warnings passed through the centuries. Never trust the silence of that river, for it carries voices you cannot hear until it is too late. What unsettles investigators the most is not the family's act itself, but the way it seemed to echo through generations, as though the hunger had not died with them. Decades after the ruins of their home were cleared, records began to surface of distant relatives, strange incidents in towns far away, where their bloodline had quietly scattered. In one city, a girl was caught stealing scraps from a butcher. But what she clutched most tightly was not bread or meat. It was marrow bones, gnawed raw. In another village, a man was seen lurking near graveyards at dusk, his clothes caked in earth, his hands trembling as though he had touched what no living hand should. The connection was always denied, but whispers linked them back to that family. The villagers believed a curse had been born the night the daughter's flesh was eaten, a pact with hunger itself, a wound that would reopen in every generation that carried their name. What chills the blood most are the accounts of children born into the lineage. Many were described as sickly, but others were marked by odd features: too wide eyes, jagged teeth, a pallor that no amount of sunlight could cure. Locals swore that when these children cried, the sound carried something deeper than grief. It was hunger, ancient and insatiable. There are rumors of one such child, taken to an orphanage after her parents were lost in a fire. Caretakers claimed she never ate the meals placed before her, but each morning, animals were found dead in the yard: birds, rabbits, even the hounds that once guarded the grounds. She was said to have watched with a strange satisfaction, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, while the others wept in fear. Psychologists who later studied these stories insisted they were fabrications, exaggerations by frightened communities. But the diaries, letters, and church records tell another story. They show patterns too precise to dismiss: famine, vanishing livestock, unexplained disappearances, always where a descendant of that bloodline was present. The curse of hunger, it seems, does not fade. It waits patient, finding its way into the mouths of children who do not yet understand what they crave. A hunger passed not through choice, but through blood itself. And once awakened, it does not rest. Every town that bore a trace of this family seemed marked by silence. Not the ordinary quiet of rural nights, but an unnatural hush that lingered after dusk. Neighbors described hearing the faintest scratching along their windows, as though fingernails dragged across the glass when the moon was high. Animals refused to go near certain homes, pulling at their leashes or bolting into the woods, leaving their owners bewildered and terrified. In one chilling account, preserved in the records of a small parish, a priest described being summoned to a farmhouse where a child of the bloodline lived. The family pleaded for help, claiming the child spoke to voices no one else could hear. When the priest arrived, he found the girl sitting in the center of the floor, her eyes fixed on the ceiling beams. She whispered names the priest swore he had never spoken aloud, names of the dead buried in unmarked graves near the river. When he asked who had told her these things, she smiled and said simply, "My sister, the one they ate." The priest fled, leaving behind his Bible, which was later discovered scorched, as though burned from within. His writings stopped abruptly after that night, but the townspeople remembered the way his sermons changed. He spoke less of salvation, more of hunger, sin, and the price of silence. Folklorists argue that these stories are nothing more than cultural hauntings, symbols of collective guilt for a tragedy no one prevented. Yet, there is something uniquely unnerving about how specific the details remain across regions and decades. The same names, the same descriptions, the same figure of the devoured daughter appearing in dreams, her face pale, her voice calm, her presence both sorrowful and accusing. Some witnesses even claimed to see her not in nightmares, but in waking life. She appeared at the edge of fields, barefoot, her dress torn as though she had been pulled from the grave. Always she was silent, but her presence left behind a sharp scent, sweet, rotten, and unforgettable. Those who smelled it swore they could never eat again without gagging, as though her memory lived on in their throats. And so, generation by generation, the curse did not fade. It spread like roots beneath the soil, unseen but unstoppable, tying each descendant to a hunger that was never theirs to choose. By the early 1900s, the story of the family was no longer just a rural whisper. It had become a cautionary tale shared in city alleys and whispered in asylum corridors. The daughter's name, though lost to official records, surfaced in letters and journals, repeated like a warning, too heavy to forget. Those who claimed to dream of her said she never screamed, never begged. She simply watched, as though waiting for someone to understand the hunger she carried with her into death. In one asylum report, a patient carved words into the walls of her cell with her fingernails. Over and over she etched the same phrase, "They are still eating." When questioned, she claimed she could see the family sitting at a long wooden table, their plates full though no food was served. She described the sound of chewing, the crunch of bones, the tearing of flesh, echoing in her head until she pressed her palms to her ears and wept blood. The doctors dismissed it as delusion, yet they noted something strange. Every patient housed in the rooms beside hers stopped eating altogether, shrinking into shadows of themselves until they too were carried away. Another record tells of a traveling photographer who wandered into the ruins of the old village where the house once stood. He returned pale and trembling, clutching his camera as if it were his only protection. When the film was developed, the photographs revealed something no one could explain. In one image, the collapsed beams of the house appeared ordinary, except for the faint outline of faces pressed into the wood, mouths open, eyes wide. In another, the river shimmered with what looked like pale arms stretching upward, as though reaching from below the surface. The photographer never worked again, and within a year, he vanished. Some historians suggest these accounts are nothing more than projections of guilt, the human mind twisting stay, privation into nightmare. But others, quieter voices, believe that once flesh has been consumed in such a way, something eternal is awakened, not just hunger, but a presence that does not rest, that moves with the bloodline, that carries itself from house to house, shadow to shadow, century to century. And perhaps that is why the story still lingers, whispered by those who dare not speak it too loudly. Because what if the family never truly ended? What if they are still among us, unseen, but waiting? The most disturbing part of this history is not the whispers of what once happened, but the possibility that it never truly stopped. In certain archives, files rarely opened, yellowed with time, there are reports of modern cases linked by an invisible thread. Families in isolated homes, neighbors vanishing without a trace, children disappearing with no explanation. And always, if you dig far enough, you find bloodlines that lead back to that single house, at the edge of the barren road. One case from the 1970s describes a family in Eastern Europe who lived quietly on the outskirts of a small town. When investigators finally entered their home after reports of strange smells, they discovered scraps of journals filled with drawings. Faces of a girl with hollow eyes, repeated again and again. In the cellar, jars were found stacked neatly, each containing something unidentifiable but unmistakably organic. The family themselves were gone, leaving only the drawings and the scent of decay. To this day, no trace of them has ever been found. Even in the modern world, stories surface. People walking alone at night along riverbanks claim to see a pale figure watching from the reeds. Her presence silent, but heavy enough to freeze the body in place. Travelers describe knocking sounds on their doors in the dead of night, only to open them and find nothing but the lingering smell of rot. And in quiet kitchens, where families sit down to dinner, there are moments when the scraping of a knife against bone sounds just a little too real, as though echoing something much older than the meal before them. The daughter's flesh may have been consumed long ago, but the act itself seems to have birthed a hunger that no generation has managed to contain. Some say it is not hunger at all, but memory, that once you taste the body of someone you love, the bond becomes eternal, binding you in ways he living cannot understand. Perhaps this is why the story has never been allowed to fully fade. Because deep down, we know hunger is not just a physical need. It is an echo, a calling, and sometimes it is strong enough to consume us whole.